Now we'll start talking a little bit about photosynthesis. And in doing that, we all know that plants take sunlight and turn it into food. That's what we think of with photosynthesis. So let's back up a little bit and take a look at light. Sunlight that comes to Earth from the sun is a mixture of different wavelengths. You see the Roy G. Biv. The middle section of that is visible, the visible wavelengths. That's called the visible light spectrum. Here's our Roy G. Biv. There are some wavelengths of light that are more easily gathered by plants than others. What does that gathering are light-absorbing molecules called pigments. The plant's principal pigment is chlorophyll, which you probably have also heard before. There are two types of chlorophyll found in plants, A and B. They absorb light very well in the blue, violet, and red regions of the visible spectrum, but not in the green region. Leaves reflect green light, which is why plants look green. So if you take a look here, the wavelengths of light that are absorbed best are in the reddish-orange area and the blue-violet area. That's what light is used in photosynthesis. The green light is not absorbed. It's reflected back to our eyes. That's why we perceive plants as green. There are other pigments besides chlorophyll that absorb light in other regions of the spectrum. These are called, one of these examples is carotene. Most of the time, the green color overwhelms and covers up the other pigments, but as temperatures drop in the fall, chlorophyll molecules break down, and then we can see those red and orange pigments, which is why leaves turn colors in the fall. Photosynthesis takes place inside specific organelles called chloroplasts within plants. Chloroplasts have two main parts. They have these stacks of little pancakes. The pancakes are called thylakoids, and they are stacked into structures called grana, and this is where pigments are located. The space surrounding the thylakoids is called the stroma. I always say stroma begins with S, space begins with S. So that's how you can remember that. Here's what you see. These are the thylakoids that are stacked into a granum, single stack. So because light's a form of energy, any compound that absorbs light absorbs energy. That's what chlorophyll does. So a large fraction of this is transferred to electrons, and that's what drives photosynthesis. Electrons need to be carried, and NADP is a carrier molecule. Each molecule of NADP holds 2 high-energy electrons and transports it to chemical reactions elsewhere in the cell. I'll show you how that works in just a little bit. So keep in mind, photosynthesis uses the energy of sunlight. It's a catalyst to convert water and carbon dioxide into sugars and oxygen. Make sure you're familiar with that reaction, that overall reaction in the chemical formulas there. And then plants use the sugars generated by photosynthesis to produce complex carbohydrates such as starches for cell walls and to provide energy for the synthesis of other compounds, including proteins and lipids. And it's used to produce the magical mystery energy molecule we just learned was ATP. There are 2 sets of reactions in photosynthesis. The first is the light-dependent reactions. They require the direct involvement of light and light-absorbing pigments. Basically, they use energy from the sunlight to produce ATP and NADPH, that electron carrier we were just talking about. These reactions take place in the thylakoids, right here. This is where water is required. It's a source of electrons and hydrogen ions, and this is where oxygen is released. Thylakoids contain clusters of chlorophyll and proteins known as photosystems. Photosystems absorb sunlight and generate high-energy electrons. Now, please note, photosystem 2, don't know why, comes before photosystem 1. So the flow of what's happening here goes from left to right in the light-dependent reactions. There are different parts of this diagram that are highlighted in these different pictures. The flow goes like this. So just keep in mind and take a look at the different aspects of the overall reaction. So right here we have sunlight coming in. We have that sunlight literally splitting water. We have the hydrogen ions, and then the oxygen is released into the atmosphere. Those electrons move over and are transferred to electron carriers here. Meanwhile, we have this structure here pumping hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space. Now we have more light absorbed into photosystem 1. More hydrogen ions going on there. And then what you see happening is, again, you see the NADP accepting those electrons. The NADPH will go to the light-independent reactions. This is where sugar is made. The other thing that's going on here is the electrons go over to the light-independent reactions to help fuel that process. And then we have all these hydrogen ions that have been created from water being split. They're being pumped through the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid space. There's this huge accumulation of hydrogen ions, and you don't have to understand why or how this happens, but just know that when these hydrogen ions move through this enzyme called ATP synthase, that's an enzyme that makes ATP, we see ADP, that extra phosphate gets added to ATP. Now we have a source of stored energy that again goes to the light-independent reactions. So, what we have here, the light-dependent reactions produce oxygen. They convert ADP and NADPH into the energy carriers ATP and NADPH. These guys that were produced provide the energy needed to build high-energy sugars like glucose from low-energy carbon dioxide. So now we move on to the light-independent reactions. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it's used in the second part of photosynthesis to produce sugars and other carbohydrates. So during the light-independent reactions, those molecules that were produced in the light-dependent reactions, ATP and NADPH, are used to produce glucose. No light is required to power the light-independent reactions, so this can happen at night. Takes place outside the thylakoids in the stroma, in the surrounding space. The light-independent reactions are also known as the Calvin cycle. We're going to talk about a couple of different cycles. If you want to think Calvin cycle takes place in the chloroplast, those both begin with C. That might help you remember that the Calvin cycle is part of photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide enters the Calvin cycle from the atmosphere. You see that right here. An enzyme there combines carbon dioxide with other carbon compounds, and you don't have to understand every step of the Calvin cycle, but just know that carbon dioxide is used in the Calvin cycle. And then, as the cycle moves around, we have energy from ATP and the high energy electrons from NADPH. Both of those, remember, are from the light reactions. That energy is used to what we call turn or fuel or drive the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle uses 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to produce a single 6-carbon sugar molecule, which we know as glucose, C6H12O6. Here's the Calvin cycle in its entirety. Like I said, you don't have to memorize this. You just have to understand that carbon dioxide goes in, the ATP and the NADPH come in to drive the Calvin cycle, and glucose comes out. So again, just to summarize, the energy for the reactions is supplied by compounds produced in the light-dependent reactions. You see it here, you see it here, you see it here. The plant uses the sugars produced by the Calvin cycle, aka glucose, to produce energy to build macromolecules needed for growth and development. So plants are doing this on their own. When other organisms eat plants, they can use that energy and the raw materials stored in these compounds. So we have 2 sets of reactions working together. The light-dependent reactions trap the energy of sunlight in chemical form. The light-independent reactions use that chemical energy to produce high-energy sugars from carbon dioxide and water. In the process, we and other animals get food and an atmosphere filled with oxygen. There are enzymes that drive photosynthesis. And remember way back when we talked about enzymes, that temperature plays a role in how effective enzymes are. So enzymes function best in photosynthesis between 0 and 35 degrees Celsius. Temperatures above or below this range can denature those enzymes and can slow down or stop photosynthesis entirely. Light intensity increases the rate of photosynthesis, but only to a certain point. There's a maximum rate of photosynthesis that you can see here. You see a leveling off, and it's less in shade plants, than it is in the sun. Because water is one of the raw materials in photosynthesis, a shortage of water can slow or even stop it. Water loss can also damage plant tissues. Plants that live in dry conditions have adaptations, waxy coatings on their leaves to reduce water loss. They can have biochemical adaptations that make photosynthesis more efficient under dry conditions.